No.
Live on YouTube.
Yeah. So, hey guys, welcome. Welcome everybody else, which is probably no one, but just in case anybody in the cyber world decides to come into these very early stages, we're popping this something like a working discussion called Resurrecting. We're doing these conversations live and recording them out there on YouTube, and maybe eventually between transcripts and other sorts of things, maybe we'll get some useful material from this. So we're in the middle. Excuse me a second, I'm going to have to mute something here for this to be on my machine.
Uncle Tom, is your microphone covered up? You don't sound as clear as normal to me.
Yeah, you're pretty muffled.
Can't figure out why that is. How about now?
I think it's a connection thing, potentially.
I don't know.
Hmm.
It sounds like that one time when you had your mic covered on accident, but
Notes to self, draping on the side of the computer. Let's try that. Any better?
there you go. Yeah, that sounds better.
Culprit identified. All right, then let's I'm going to jump back to this slide deck, and we want to pick up where we were last time. Last time should be pretty easy to look at. It was episode the good and the true. We talked about that a little bit. The key idea there, if you're catching up, is that I promised to get the reality slides. We get to one of those slides, so maybe that's not surprising since we're covering all of reality. Anyway, we're talking about the good and the true, and a particular account, a particular way of thinking about the good and the true, which I want to start by refreshing, because it's going to point us toward, I think it points us toward conscious realism, and doesn't just point us toward it in a suggestive way, although it does do that. I think there's actually an implication here, which is pretty interesting, and I'd love to hear what you guys think about it. I haven't tried it out on anybody yet, so you guys are the first victims.
All right.
So we'll see how it goes.
Ready and willing here.
Cool. So this cool little image here is imagine individuals at the smallest level, or maybe these are each one of these little things that looks like a dot is in fact one of these large things, tiny little small. And the suggestion there is that even our brains are a network of processing agents. Maybe agents is a strong word, or maybe not. How strong it is will depend upon what we end up with when we take a deeper dive into, particularly into what Jeff Hawkins is the model of intelligence that he sketches, which he calls the 1,000 brain theory. And the idea is these tiny little cortical columns are all independent processes in effect, woven together, wired up with lots of inputs, not necessarily all the same. And they're creating multiple accounts inside the same person's brain, which is just suggestive at this point. Surely something like this is going on. Surely we've got a lot of computation going on the inside, and there are lots of elements doing the computing. That much at that level of vagueness, I think is pretty obvious. And then whatever comes out of our heads, right? Whatever comes out of that process, we share. And you can imagine us sharing in a network of 7. Today we're 3, but this is a little network of 7 here, everybody talking to everybody else. And if those people were very much like you, you could imagine parallel processing the world a little bit. Just for fun, we imagine if they're exactly like you, they were clones of you, just like you, right? Then you could send yourself to different places at the same time, compare notes when you come back, etc. That's inside a community, but then of course we've got different communities And we all know that those different communities have got really different, or at least they might have very different takes on the world. What they have in common might be very different from one to another community. Yet, in Alistair McIntyre's work, as we said, there really is an algorithm for comparing one take on the world to another and really putting yourself in contact with the information that's gathered cognitively and non-cognitively in other communities. All of that is just a summary of this little graph and maybe the first part of this bullet point from last time. And then it's in that context that a definition of good and true arises, because what we might be looking for is a stable computation, a stable output from this whole information processing system, stable with regard to the inclination of the agents in there, what it is they see and want to incline toward and make happen. That kind of stable inclination might be, it's certainly in the neighborhood of what the good is. And according to informed desire theorists, that's a promising place to look for the good. We looked at a paper together on that point. The same thing, though, is true with perhaps truth. Remember, we just started with information, which is whatever occurs to you, whatever you actually see, whatever it looks like to you, that's information. That's what's pouring in. Or at least hard to know at what level of processing that emerges, but it certainly emerges, and it emerges in you uniquely, right? You got your own take on it somehow. You can share it with other people and you can compare notes with other people, but you got your purchase on this, right? You got the way the world looks to you, both what you see, how you reason, things that persuade you, things that attract you, all of that sort of stuff is experience, your experience, taking information in that way. There seems to be no standard, right? I'm not talking about information as some sort of veridical homomorphic mapping, to use the language which we've read in Donald Hoffman's paper, right? I'm not talking about a homomorphic mapping between the external objective reality and your perceptual field. A mapping which Hoffman says, as a matter of fact, evolutionary theory tells us there's zero chance of having that mapping actually be homomorphic, right? That's not what's happening, even though so many of his perception colleagues is. And maybe he's right about that, maybe he's not, he's got an argument for it. But in any case, if you begin with information as the way it seems to you, right, what's exactly in the immediate awareness of the conscious agent, then what's going on in this processing here seems almost independent in some way of the world out there. At least there's been nothing said about homomorphic mapping, right, with some independent reality. Then where does this process stop? This information processing stop? What if it stops when it has the best model so far of all the things it's experienced so far? And it achieved a kind of stability. Just, hey, you know, I kind of like looking at it this way. This makes sense to me.
Yeah.
What's the difference, you might ask, between that and being right? Between this is the way it looks to me and my judgments about the world are true. There's no homomorphic mapping, some independent reality that's in the foundation of this way of thinking, not that I can see unless I'm missing something, right? We're starting with appearance. We're starting with experience. We're taking that as fundamental. And then we're imagining that there's some kind of relationship with everything else, including my relationship to you guys and yours to me, and all of our relationship to everything else that's apparently not the same as us, right? Not exactly the same as us. You aren't the same as me, exactly, right? I cannot control you in the way I can control a lot of things. That's good for you. right? So there's some reasonable thinking that you're kind of like the rest of the world with respect to me, right? Somehow not inside my, not part of what I operate. Instead, it's something I relate to, and we draw some kind of distinction. And that whole rest of the world, whatever the heck that is, I experience in a certain way, and I achieve a certain kind of stability, or maybe I don't achieve stability, but maybe I might. Maybe it'd be nice if I did, if I knew what to think, if I knew a good experience that worked out pretty well. It's a way of looking at the world that works out pretty well for me, including in my exchanges with you and all the challenges that you put to me. That stability is something like stable assent. I rest in this, in this pursuit. I'm inclined toward it, perceiving it that way as a particular good for me that I figure this out finally, right? Maybe I have a stable inclination towards sitting on that way of looking at things. I could pick it up and turn it around and look at it from other people's points of view if I want to, right? But I might come back to this one and say, I got this one. I think I like this one. This one is, what would we say about it? Probably fruitful. It helps me. I think I know what to do. I think I have some answers. That's a view of truth. That doesn't look like any kind of naive correspondence theory of truth. It's a kind of relational stability view of truth. Between me and gosh, I don't know what else. Certainly between me and you, right? I mean, if I have an account of you and I work it out in conversation with you, and we might even share that stability. A community might share that stability. A network might, a whole society might, a whole civilization might conceivably arrive at some sort of stability, best account so far, in the way that a lot of people who think very differently on a lot of issues achieve a certain kind of stability around deliverances of the modern sciences.
Yeah. I mean, I think that fits in, that explanation fits in great with what we talked about with the informed desire theory, right?
I think so.
I mean, that sounds like what we're talking about, right?
The ideal tradition.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So you are both pointing to things. First, John, maybe you could say a little more about the informed desire resonance there, and then maybe John Rose, you could say something about the ideal tradition, because that's a phrase that I haven't used yet in our conversations together, just in that paper.
Well, so what I'm thinking with the informed desire account, what's resonating with me in this description is you talking about stability and practicing to stability. It's like it's a solution that works for you consistently. This way of seeing things is something that works. And so the reason that makes me think of the informed desire account, I'm thinking of it as the regret element of that. It's reminding me of that, where maybe you tried something else and that gave you a little bit more information, but you regretted not approaching it this different way, right? The most stable way with regards to experiencing less regret, that's the most stable one for you moving forward. That's the way you want to move forward with it.
Sure. Regret, including regret with regard to assent.
Yeah.
Although we don't really think of it that way, but we say, shit, right? I made a mistake. That
Right.
wasn't the right way. We might be frustrated, as I just suggested. But even if we're not frustrated, maybe we're just glad to have left it behind. But point is, we've just like an inclination we leave behind. That's sort of regret is. We say, "Oop, wrong move. Wish I hadn't done that." We might think, glad I don't think that anymore. Right? I've left it behind.
Right.
I think that was
right.
Cool.
That's what that description made me think of with regards to informed desire.
Yeah, and I mean, it seems pretty similar to what I was referencing in the same way that I think the ideal tradition is pretty similar to the informed desire, just solving for some of the weaknesses. And I mean, you're talking about communities, and that had much more to do with the ideal tradition than it did with full information, I thought. So
I think so. So what you mean by solving for some of the weaknesses, if I'm quoting you correctly, I think I get your point. That is, there's some challenges to how you can understand full information as somehow ever being gathered or even being coherent or something like that, right? And there some of those challenges can be met when you break it down into the social information processing domain, right? Which takes us into the idea of societies that gather information through non-cognitive connection. We put people, we pass information down in some ways at a faster, more efficient, much greater. It's like we boil off the best findings and we pass those down in a way that looks good, right? They look good, they're persuasive, they look like that they make sense, but they're not grounded in all the investigation that was done, all the blood, sweat, and tears that went into percolating up. Instead, right, they're sort of the fruit of a tradition. And maybe you know something about the history of that tradition, and maybe you don't, but one way or the other, you get the fruit of it. You get some really cool technology to use, for example, or you get maybe some really good examples to follow, right? And you don't know how those good examples learned everything they know, but you might follow them nonetheless. And that all that points to, well, that's still all inside one community. And then the idea of the ideal tradition makes reference to a comparison between communities and a theoretical ideal. We may not hope to hit, perhaps, but it would be nice if we could hit it. It would at least be nice if we could aim at it. Put it this way, if there was a richer way of looking at things that got a more stable purchase on everything and had something to say, in fact, persuaded members of every other tradition or any other tradition, I should say, in sort of one-on-one encounters with them at a high information level of exchange. That is when mature members of the community become second, first language speakers of another community, right? In that kind of exchange, and following McIntyre's algorithm here, you might at least think of striving for an ideal tradition. Mostly I grab the name ideal because people use the name ideal advisor theory in full information account literature. This is what ideal, no one has all the information, but what would your ideal self advise you to do, right? What would your ideally informed self advise you to do? And that seems to be a dead end in that literature. People seem to think it's got real bad troubles, right? And we rehearse some of those troubles I did in that paper. But you can get around a lot of those troubles when you break it out into a community context. And certainly, it's very clear you can grow the amount of information gathering capacity. That's very clear. And you can run certain kind of experiments that you can't run all in your own head, but you can run them with different people if those different people, if you have a theory of natural kinds about those people, so that what this person experienced in this situation, I don't have to die of a drug overdose to know that I'd regret it too, because I think I'm probably like that person in that respect, right? Or that's a silly example off the cuff. Okay, so that's why the idea of an ideal tradition comes. So then the true then and the good, what's good is what a mature member of an ideal tradition would incline toward. And what's true is what a mature member of an ideal tradition would assent to.
So what to?
It's ideal, insofar as it's stable. And all you get
assent to, John.
Thank you. Assent. Yes. Agree is true. So maybe we'll pause there for a second because we've just set up. I think we're right where we want to be to take it now a dive further into conscious realism, but let's just make sure that the cake settles as we take all the other truth.
Are we just saying the best we can do and then just calling it true? Because I don't think you can ever, like, that's just not my common understanding of what true means. But I think that's how you're using it, it seems.
It is how I'm proposing that we consider thinking about true that way. It's got some very interesting features. Number one, it looks like the way we form our scientific beliefs, right? We don't think our scientific beliefs, think they're the best we have so far. They're models of the world that give us the best purchase we have so far. We expect it eventually in some kind of inquiry to be overturned in respect to how and to need to increasingly modify, but without throwing out Isaac Newton, for example, right? When more modern physics comes along, we modify it, right? Newton's a good approximation. So what if it were the case that to be right about how the physical world works is to have a model of how it works that survives all these comparisons, even as we probe it further and further and further. It survives in some sense of survives. At least it's a recognizable stepping stone to the next stage, right? So that it's not a complete rejection. In that sense, we say Newton got it right? At a certain level, even. Lots he didn't know yet. And that's what it is for Newton to be right. Now that's a really different claim. And this is what I think you were pushing back at, right? In the sense that that's not what I mean. I mean, wait, that's the way the world really is.
Mm-hmm.
And notice there is no way the world really is in this whole line of thought.
Yeah, we skipped over the homomorphism thing entirely.
I think so. Or if you don't, that's a good question. Let's put a pin in that. Whether you get rid of it entirely, you certainly, there may be something we're presuming here, like the existence of conscious agents, because we started with the idea that people have experiences. Start there. Process that information. Not referenced to something else. Just in itself, process that information. That's the way we experience it, but we might experience it better. As a matter of fact, we talk about things in a certain way. It'd be nice here to have a pedagogically really effective, sort of like a fish ladder, right? To move from raw experience into higher and higher, more tutored experience. And I don't have a single fish ladder for that. I can think of lots of fast and poor examples. Poor just because they're not a home run. You know what I mean? They're just another way of looking at it. But the stuff you think about the world when you're a kid in some ways is right, and in other ways it's not right. You got a lot to learn, we say, right? And you think you should tell the truth, for example. Well, maybe you should tell the truth if you're going to get caught, right? That's what you think when you're at a certain age, right? I think it's the case that every kid goes through that stage. Most goes through that stage. Most kids don't remember it, but every kid lies. Every single little kid lies. If they lie, there's something wrong with them. It's a cool strategy for getting the world to behave the way you want. You have to explore it. You have to learn it, right? And hopefully somebody says, yeah, you can manipulate the world that way, but it's better if you don't. Right? They tease you out a little bit. They guide you out, right, toward honesty. And this is sort of what's meant by raise up a child in the way she should go, and when she's old, she won't depart from it. turns out there's a craft of being a human being with regard to truth telling in our interactions with people, with habit associated with it is habit. So, yeah. So maybe it just, what makes it better, to be honest? It could be just, it's how you process information if you get more and more of it. What makes it, and now let's shift to truth. What makes it true that it's better to be, if anything, on this view here? What is it that makes it true? I think it's that hanging on to honesty as part of a broad way of looking at the world that you put together with a lot of other people, and that you against a lot of other alternatives. In this full information comparison, it keeps coming out a victor. You keep saying, no, this is good. There is a way forward here. This is the best account we have of how to engage with one another with respect to truth telling. I'm going to hang on to that. That's why it's good. That's true. And this is going further. This is saying, it's not just the ground of that being true in that particular case. I think we're saying, I think what we're discussing here, we're saying in that sense, I think what I'm trying to say, certainly trying to explore, is that that is what it is to be true. The true is that stable situation. Let's, there's no external world here. They're not in this picture. I don't mean to say I'm denying that there's anything other than me. Definitely is, right? And I don't mean to say that there's nothing other than things that are conscious. Although what they are, I mean, give me an example. How about the wall plug across the road? There's a piece of plastic with 3 holes in it, right? Times 2, right? Do I think that's conscious? No, I don't think so. No sign. All I mean by that is you're not going to construct a very successful account of the world, right? If you spend a lot of time talking to that piece of plastic, right? It's not going to talk back. It's not going, so far as we know, it's not going to produce much for you, right? If you engage it that way, it's better to engage it as an inanimate object that we forge. We do with it what we want. We don't think of it as having needs, right? For example, we don't treat it like a person. What makes it right? It is. It's that we don't treat it like one when we're ideally informed.
But yeah, but what is it? It seems to me that true's, the meaning of it starts to, because I mean, you could imagine living in the past and imagining that certain things were true then, right? I mean, all the best information, all the best science told you this, and the best informed people of that time told you this was true.
Right.
But now we would look at that and say that's not true now, right?
We would. If
we would look back and that would be like, that is not true anymore because we have this new information.
Well, I wouldn't say it's not true anymore. It's not thought to be true anymore. It wasn't true because they were not yet, right? Those were not the inclinations of mature members of an ideal tradition. They were the best account, perhaps. I mean, if it was a really wonderful set of people in very fortunate circumstances, they might have had the best account so far at that time. Yeah. So they had a candidate, a non-trivial candidate for truth when they said the things they said that we now say are false. But we now say they're false because of new information that we've gathered that they didn't have. We think that we could have persuaded them based upon the information we now have. They might be technology that, think of this in some scientific opinion, right? This, we can now determine, and here it'd be better if I had a nice example from the history of science, but something was being emitted from that piece of uranium you had. I'm thinking back in the days where all the scientists died early deaths, Marie Curie among them, right? Because they spent a lot of time without really knowing what was happening, right, with radioactive materials. We now have a breakdown of what those various elements are, right? We can now prescribe very sensible courses of action that they did not have the basis for. And my guess is we could persuade them retroactively, right? Yeah. We could show them the experiments, the results of experiments, and we'd say, oh, wow.
Yeah.
And they'd get fast education.
But it seems like what we're moving forward with is that there isn't something that we could never say something is objectively true on this model. It would always be subject to it would always be subject to being updated, right? There's nothing outside. There's nothing
to being updated. Susceptible, if that's the same as subject.
Yeah, sorry. Susceptible is a much better word. Yeah. But I mean, yeah.
No, that's right. So it doesn't follow, though, that none of the things we have are not precisely the things we would continue to hold on to, come what may. And that we don't have good reasons for thinking the things that we are holding on to, supposing come what may. Right, we may have good reason for hanging on to those things.
Yeah.
And we might be right about it. So we may have what the philosophers would call warranted true belief.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like mathematics is an easy thing to talk about. I mean, in this case, it seems to me you could say 2 + 2 = 4 objectively. And so, I mean, it's like everyone.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it sort of stands out. I mean, there's not going to be a way in which that isn't true based on there is no more information to incorporate. I mean, part of that's unfair because we just defined 2 and 2 to equal 4, but.
If we define it or if we discover it.
Yeah, well, I guess I showed my hand there with regards to how I think about math, but, I don't know.
Isn't that interesting, John? On the view that I'm putting forward so far, we might very well have discovered it.
Right.
It's not there to be discovered. It is a feature of the world that we're going to interact with in a stable way only by recognizing.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
But the ground of its the ground of its being so is that it's in us and it's in the thing. It's relationship between us will stabilize under certain, would call it recognition conditions, when you come to see it, right? It's maybe that's a too small an example to pick. It'd be better if we figured out, say, what prime numbers are, right? Something like that that's not so immediately obvious, right? You have to be what prime numbers are, and you'd probably have to be, you can learn some about them. You can run down the road a long way. And there are mathematical conjectures apparently one could be wrong about prime numbers, right? Things like, but I guess the point is there are prime numbers, and what's meant by that on this emerging suggestion here, right, is that you won't succeed. you will not stabilize in your interaction with the mathematical world until you recognize that fact. In fact, you're probably going to recognize it very early on in the investigation, right? You expect the Greeks to have figured it out.
Yeah.
I just mean as long as there's been coherent, ordered, and written down transferring of results from investigation, that they're more or less going to assert, right, that some things like there are prime numbers and that there are some larger than 100. That's a fact about mathematical reality.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think 103 is one, but I don't remember the prime number. But we know exactly what test for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's we could just go right to whiskey right now and sit around and think for a long time, right, about these things. My thought is it takes a while. If we get this far, which we might not, I think we won't today, probably, but the nature of the inquiry we're engaged in right now is very helpful to put in as soon as we can. And it's inquiry which Plato is actually a master of and identified this inquiry. And I think it will help us someday, but it may not be today that we get to it. What I wanted to get to today is the connection to conscious realism. And maybe you can almost already see it, because what have we built into this world already in thinking it through other than conscious agents? This is an information process. And what we started with information is the stuff. We could be forgiven for this, maybe because we don't know much physics or much information theory. But we do think about ourselves as being informed when we learn stuff that matters to us, even stuff that doesn't matter to us, but might matter to us, right? That is the stuff. It's stuff that we become aware of, and we are informed by it. So why not start there, right? And see where that processing goes. And we've just sort of run it through this multi-layer possibility and at least wondered that maybe there's an algorithm that we just aren't implementing, although we sometimes implement it in some extent. And in some areas we do implement it. But we could be implementing it more broadly. And if we did, it suggests an endpoint of inquiry. I don't mean a terminus like that's it, nothing else to see here. I just mean a goal of inquiry, which is something like stability in this hunt. All right. So let's talk about for a minute good, true, and conscious realism. We've spent enough time on this. I don't know why I thought it would be worth mentioning here, but it's nice to see somehow that this good and true account is technically an entangled account. These things are entangled. You can't fully specify what's true without fully specifying what's good. And you can't fully specify what's good. You can't identify goods without identifying some truths on this model, right? These things are, they point at one another. This has been widely recognized for forever. I'm familiar with Aquinas's recognition of it, but no doubt way before then. I don't remember it in Aristotle, but it's probably there because it's pretty straightforward. My guess is it's in Aristotle too. Okay. So then the question is, we've already asked it in a way, what's the standard here? These are both relational quantities, entangled relational quantities. It's as if conscious agents, or that is informed entities, and other things, some of whom might also be informed entities and some of which might not be. It does seem like what is good on this model is irreducibly tied to what's going on inside of conscious agents. It's irreducibly tied to inclinations, and inclinations are the things you have, the things you're aware of on this model. so far. We've started with you have information about those inclinations. You know what you want. You don't always know everything you want, right? And I'm not saying it can't be complex. There's all areas here, but you can feel want. You can experience desire, right? And there may be, we could probe at this point, but let's move past it for now. And the same thing is true with things being true. They're irreducibly tied to the judgments of conscious agents. And that suggests that somehow conscious agents are woven into the ultimate standard of true and good, whatever that is. If there's a right answer in the computation, if in the information processing, how should you treat other people? Should you lie to them? Should you use them to take, and I'm starting deliberately with moral claims, or should you underestimate their capabilities all the time? Should you overestimate their capabilities all the time? I'm putting in obvious falsehoods that people eventually learn, right? And they say, no, you got to have some kind of measure here. There are ways to treat people. And there's a kind of stability that comes out of that. These stabilities are kind of like minimum. This is a good time to mention it. They're kind of like minima in a function. In an energy function, they're kind of like an energy well. When things fall in and they don't get out. That's what I mean by raise up a child in the way she should go. When she's old, she won't depart from it. Honest people tend to remain honest people. They tend to. Being deeply, thoroughgoingly honest people who understand and can articulate the value of being honest. And they're going to lie to you tomorrow, right? They are reliable in a certain sense. It's as if they've fallen into a certain way of being, and they process information that way and not some other way. And they might be only local minima in this, whatever this energy well is that they've fallen into. Or they might be, it could be that no matter how you shake it, you keep falling into that once you've been exposed to certain kinds of information. That is a question. And you have to run the computation. You have to live life in order to answer it. If that makes any sense. Living life is running the computation.
Yeah.
Let's see, JP, you've been listening to Wolfram, at least you've tied into Wolfram once or twice, right?
Mm-hmm.
Something like this, an ongoing, at a much higher level, an ongoing sort of working discussion. Why did I jump to Wolfram? There was a reason for it.
The computation's moving forward.
And his computational irreducibility claim.
Yeah.
In a certain sense, this is a deterministic world on Wolfram's view, right? Mm-hmm. There are answers, but there are no shortcuts to all kinds of answers. Turns out sometimes there are, because it's a complicated system. But in general, it's quite often the case, it's typically the case, that you got to actually do the computation in order to get the answer. You can't second guess it. Mm-hmm. And that's what's happening with regard to this information processing paradigm. You've got to experience life. You've got to live it. You've got to run it out.
Yeah. We
do actually try to get shortcuts all the time. You don't want your kids to make every single mistake you made. I can tell you. And everybody knows that, right? You want to save people certain steps. People want to save themselves steps. And that is suggesting that you can shortcut the computation. And sometimes you can, and sometimes maybe you can't.
Yeah.
Something like that. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's these, so we are computing. We're trying to find these stable, these low potential energy processes. And we're trying to combine them, and we're trying to interweave them into a craft of, this is what we think about the world. These are low potential energy assertions we make. We're going to keep making these assertions. And here I have in mind, drop in your favorite physics or your favorite chemistry. The world does, in fact, seem to break out in a very useful model, right? Where you have these valence shells, and I could have a really simple understanding of chemistry here, right? But you get these valence shells, and there's a pattern that keeps it's that repetition of the pattern maps homomorphically onto the emergence of certain kinds of properties, right? And this is modern chemistry. I mean, this is chemistry 100 years, right? Periodic table. And it turns out that we discovered that, and that's probably not going to go away. It's probably going to be there to be explained, and we can add new insight to it, but there's a fundamental sort of pattern between these various, what look like various ways of exploring the world that are really different, right? Probing for electronic structure is a really different sort of thing than dropping it in water and seeing what happens. Right? Very different. But it turns out that those things sort of, that there are patterns there, and those patterns are reliable, okay?
Yeah.
And those, according to Donald Hoffman, are patterns which we've evolved. They're fitness patterns. Not just the science, and I'm getting maybe a little ahead of Hoffman, but even the recognition of there being water there in the first place, what we call water, even that is a stable interaction. Turns out we interact really well with the world within certain temperature frame, right? If we experience it in a certain kind of way, we've kind of evolved to do so. We've evolved to see water. We've evolved to drink it, to interact with it in a certain way, and it's stable. It's got a fitness payoff, says Hoffman. Okay. On his view, conscious agents are somehow involved in whatever it is that's actually going on, right? Conscious agents. Well, it's not clear because we haven't actually got to that part of Hoffman. Put it this way. Agents, he does say conscious agents, and I just don't want to get too far ahead of that we're not well prepared to say, that we haven't done our homework to say. Let's say that Hoffman leaves a void. We've got this. The void is naive physicalism. There's a world out there. It's basically the way we see it. That's the way it really is, right? And light bounces off it and shows it to us, right? That's basically that's the way we look at it. And we wouldn't have survived if that thing weren't really out there. But that's what people perceive. That's what the perception theorists perceive about the world. And Hoffman's saying they're not right. That there's that evolutionary theory when you run it, when you mathematize it and run it, it shows that chances of that happening are zero over time. So something else has got to fill the gap here, right? And as a matter of fact, Hoffman thinks it's conscious agents, but look at what we've just done by starting with the processing experience and working it all the way through these levels according to a certain algorithm, which could produce something like an emerging answer, an emerging stable set of answers, or stable in certain respects, right, at a time. That seems also like it points to an irreducible role for conscious agents, because conscious agents are the ones that have the experience that's being processed in that system. So this is the suggestion, right? There's just a short step here, right? That what there is what we are conscious of somehow. What there is, what we can ever stably say about what there is what we can become conscious of in a stable sort of relationship. And now, so somehow consciousness is irreducible. Now that's a kind of conscious realism. It's to say that consciousness is irreducible Then the question is consciousness of what? You might say, look across the room, well, we're conscious of all that stuff over there, but all that stuff over there is stuff that is in a certain way present to us in consciousness. What if all there is what's present to us in consciousness? And what we're working forward toward is a stable way of relating to all the things that are present to us in consciousness. That's beginning to sound like conscious realism. It's beginning to sound weird, freaking weird. I would totally grant you. John, you put your finger right on it when you said, well, that's not what I mean by truth. I mean correspondence with the stuff in the world, right? I get it. Everybody means that. And there are kinds of correspondence. I just pointed to a cool kind of correspondence between experiments we do on electrons and the experiments we do when we drop certain metals in water. There's a correspondence there, right? And now we're conscious of both of those things. The possibility is that the correspondence between the one and the other, between theory and experiment, let's say, is a correspondence. It's all correspondence in our head. It's all the way we've evolved to perceive the world. If we didn't have correspondences like that, we wouldn't have any models that kept telling us the same thing over and over again. That's what models do. Oh, this is another one of those. I'm going to tell you what's going to happen here. You can predict what's going to happen here because you got a model of that. You recognize that. It's one of these. Maybe that's what evolves in our brains. Or rather, that's what evolves in conscious agents. Our account of our brain is one of those things. This is how we account for the way information comes to us. It comes to us, we say, through our senses. But of course, our senses are things which operate in the world or another part of the world, right? Your brain, my brain, etc. And we're processing all of that. And maybe all of that is it's a stable interaction. We're going to keep looking with the senses we have that we've evolved to have, whatever that is. All I mean by that, and I need a different word of sense now, with the way stuff pours into conscious experience, sensing in that sense, the source of conscious awareness. That somehow we have we've got models that we work with. And among those models are our model of the brain. This is a different way of looking at things. Now let's take one more step, because we're almost done taking this step. And this doesn't go down seamlessly all at once. This is another way of looking at the world, and you've got to sort of get in it and let it bake. I can't pontificate about that, but I can tell you that's the way it was with me. I think you can grasp the idea in a certain shift. What you can't know is how much work is that idea going to do for you. So I think you can grasp the idea of a different account of truth and goodness. And you could say things that you could repeat that pattern over and over again, and you'd get it right away, relatively right away. I don't mean that it will be really strange to tell people, because you don't know all its implications right away. That's what has to bake. But you can tell when you're on the same topic right away. You can tell whether it's the same theory right away. Okay? So let's just suppose that there is an algorithm for amassing conscious experiences that involve other conscious agents. I could be Donald Hoffman saying that, I think, but I've read one of his books and I've heard him 10 times, something like that, 20 times, I don't know. But I'm not a Donald Hoffman expert, but I can't wait to ask him. But I think Donald Hoffman would say that very same thing. I wish I could repeat it. Happily, we have a transcript. But What I was talking about is not what Hoffman would say. I'm talking about that cool little diagram that we just built. I think it's cool anyway, right here. This cool little diagram in which what goes into the bottom level here, these bottom levels are little conscious entities. At the very least, count every one of these small things as a person, and that's a conscious agent. If you look at Jeff Hawkins' model and you break out what's actually going on inside the brain and the way it seems like it works, he seems to think there's little agents in there. Now, he's never said that, but I think he's committed to it. I think his little 1,000 brain theories is 1,000 agent theory. He has not said so, but I don't see how he can. I guarantee you he hasn't said so, and he probably thinks it's nonsense, because I don't think he's barking up Hoffman's tree here, right? Or he's not thinking. But I think he's committed to it, actually, because what he ascribes to that little neuronal column is an agent. It's thinking through, it's working through my experience of a cup, which he keeps giving, right? My experience of a water bottle, right? And he says it's being processed all over my head, not all over, that's a interpretation, in many different places at the same time in my multifunctionally partitioned brain. Many, many places are working this problem at the same time from different perspectives, and they're coming out with a common answer, right? Oh, that's that water bottle again.
Yeah.
Right? Like this one. And the reason I can squeeze this one and not fear for my keyboard is because I have a model of a water bottle. I know what it is. I know you step on it, put it at the wall with, but I can squeeze it, right? And I know all this stuff because maybe it's the case there's a water bottle neuron in my head. Here I have a Jennifer Aniston neuron, which you mentioned the other day, right, in mind. Maybe there's a highly specific neuron that my judgment about water bottles keeps going right to. That I don't know. But whatever it is, that highly specific neuron is wired up to lots of little cortical columns. And those cortical columns are taken in input, the sensory input from my hand here, everything from memory, from my sensory motor, my everything that goes in the sensory motor, my vision, touch, all that stuff is being put together in multiple places in my head.
Yeah. What does it mean for?
And it keeps spitting out answers. It keeps spitting out water bottle every time. Can't say it doesn't work, right? I mean, you have to say, what do you do with it next? And I'm going to come right back to you, JP. All I mean is with the foundation, that's where experience is being processed. And then we're talking about our experience. And what are we doing? Building higher level models, including, if you can imagine, models of what true is and models of what good is. We're building very higher level models, which I think is the same structure. And I think Hawkins has got an account. It's the same algorithm that works throughout your entire neocortex, which is what we're so good at. We got a lot of it, and we do that. We partition out various pieces, neuroplasticity, and we get expertise based on particular inputs to particular sections. But every section works on the same algorithm, which is why we've got these little sections that are doing the same thing successfully in different parts. Not in every part, right? But in different instances. And then part of that is the language capacity. Part of that is the development of concepts. And we're working on a new set of concepts right now. And if we start to see the world in terms of those concepts, and they start to light the world up for us, and then if you've been doing it, I actually have been for 10 years or more, many more years than that, you begin to be something like what they call an expert. You get an expert view, you get a mature inhabitant's or mature practitioner's view of what it's like to see the world that way. Now I'm sort of dragging in expert theory and applying it to the brain and bringing in McIntyre's account too. And I'm saying now, take that whole thing as a seamless, multi-layered information processing calculator of conscious experience, that Hawkins could have said. He might have a different physical picture of it. I know he does actually. But this is Jeff, I didn't mean Jeff Hawkins, I meant Donald Hoffman. That Donald Hoffman could have said. That's what's going on. That's an alternative fundamental. You can look at all of reality as if that's at the bottom of it. Now, last thing, you not only can you look at it that way, you have to look at it that way. Eventually, we're going to swing right back and talk about can you and have to, and what's the nature of argumentation in this whole case, because this is very important. There's a model. It's a model of dialectical engagement. Plato had it. We've ignored it for centuries, and it is unbelievably useful. Unbelievably useful. McIntyre is the one who's, I would say, really teased it out, really recognized it, and brought it to current day. But here's another form of argument. All that was suggested. All of that was, hey, look, we're sort of looking around and coming up with a different way of pulling the world together and saying, look at that. That's kind of an inductive process where you're reaching for something that looks like it might be a whole, that might have some power, that might be useful. That is a very key idea. It's induction. What is it you're looking at? You're looking for holes. And we, as you can tell, and I've been complaining about it right along, we don't look for holes long enough anymore. And we used to look for holes, W-H-O-L-E-S. But we've given up on that. And that's a big mistake. And it's why we're stuck the way we're stuck now. It's why we need to resurrect civility. And civility requires building communities and recognizing the value of communities that are constructing wholes of this sort, rival wholes, rival experiments, beginning from their own truths, to use that language, right? Their own view of the world, which are their own candidates for what's going to endure, but build them up and compare them to one another in full information exchanges, which is not impossible, and which we know when we describe how it is possible, almost never happens. We are on the forefront of a very, very big revolution, I think. A huge freaking revolution in information processing. And we add it just in time because we need it for the development of AI, which is also information processing. And eventually you'll see weaves through this whole picture. AI needs this picture needs AI. Both will be true, it turns out. But now let's having all of that isn't that a cool little thing we just noticed, right? That's all. Why the hell should you believe any of that? This is the first time that I'm going to try and explore an argument, and it'll be done in 10 minutes. I think you have to believe, let's see, I got to be careful here. I think you have to accept the account of good and true that is at work. That's precisely what I think there's an argument for here. That is in effect an account of rationality. It's an account of how we reason and where we're trying to get to. We're trying to figure out what's worth doing. This practical rationality. We're trying to figure out what's worth believing. It's theoretical rationality. So here's how it runs. Help me out. And here I don't have this like a geometry, but I'm fishing. I'm aiming at that argument, and I'm aiming at it with bullet points so far. So that whole multi-level conscious information processing entity, that is a thing. There is such a set. There's a set of outcomes of full information processing. And there is a coherent, associated set of standards of goodness and truth. They may not be the right standards of goodness and truth. That's precisely what we're here about to investigate. but there is a coherent account, a stable inclination, a stable ascent, stable through this whole algorithm of processing, of conscious information processing. Okay. Now suppose, and this is a proof that you recognize from geometry, suppose you prove something is true by supposing the and deriving a contradiction. It's a reductio proof. I think they call it that. They certainly do in an argument. I think they do in geometry too. But suppose there was some other account of what is true or good that really hangs together. Okay, take another account, whatever it is. Either the account that seems to cohere with this information processing algorithm, call that my account just for a minute. It's not my account, but I don't know what else to call it and I didn't prepare. Okay, we'll call it my account for a minute. Either it coheres, or call it our account for a minute because we're entertaining and thinking. Either that other account either that other account converges with our account. That is to say, it points to the very same things as true and the very same things as good. Either it converges with it or it diverges from it. At some point, it goes in another direction, says, no, this is what's true, and it's not what your account says is true. This is what's good, and these could be separate views, right? This is, take any bundle you like of alternative accounts of true and good. Either they converge or they diverge with this account. Okay, so far so good?
So far so good.
If they diverge, what does the second standard, the other standard of either, add to the first standard? That's the question. What does it add to it? It might, and here, let me get my, sorry, I'm trying to read my own text. What does the second standard add to the first?
Information of some kind, right?
It adds claims to the first. I don't know if it adds information or not.
Yeah,
it adds,
sure.
Let's see, I got a wrong word in this thing and it's throwing me off. I'm sorry. Here's what you could say, right? You could say, you're wrong. And you could wag your finger at this person who's got a stable, useful, coherent set that's maximally responsive to information through this information processing algorithm. And they think they know how to live, and they think they can persuade you that they know how to live. If you'll enter into second first language competency, if you'll run this algorithm, you'll think so too. That's what they think they have. They've got this stable purchase on conscious experiences. And you've got this other account. And you can say to them, what? What are you going to say to them? Well, I've got this other account. You could you could simply disagree with them, but what can you add to them? What is it that they're missing? That's the question.
Yeah.
If they diverge, how are you helping me by what it is you think you know when you make truth claims which are not stable assent of mature members in rich communities? The best account to emerge so far. You've got something else. You've got what? You've just got an argument. It doesn't persuade me, or it does. If it does persuade me, then it weaves into the first account, right? Then you'd have to challenge it. You'd have to say, no. on this better account of true. There's a better account of goodness than the one you think emerges from this information processing algorithm, in which case you're welcome to it. I'll admit that if they had something to say there, they'd be welcome in. But if they don't have anything to say there, then it seems like what they have to offer is not useful, is not stable, won't endure. In which case, why do we need any? It seems useless. And suppose that's if they diverge. What if they don't diverge? What if it's another way of describing exactly the same output as our standards of truth and goodness? In other words, it only maps onto their set of claims, only map onto precisely what's stable, right? Whether by way of inclination or by way of assent, inside this algorithm, this information processing algorithmic environment, the social information processor. They say, oh, I know what the truth is, and it's not stability, but it picks out exactly what stability picks out. It doesn't diverge. I'd argue that that standard, at least so far, until it can show itself otherwise, is useless. Thank you very much. We already have a standard. It's the standard of stability. So if you've diverged, we don't need you. And if you've converged, we don't need you. Either way, we don't need you. And you ought not to accept a view of reality that does nothing for you.
Yeah.
Something like that is the flow of argument I'm trying to get.
Yeah. I guess it would, I think I understand. It makes sense to me. But I think I'd be interested to see how you could, I feel like stability might mean different things to different people.
Right.
And so
that's surely on a short description, that's surely the case. But actually, we know the stability I'm talking about is the stability that we have reference to in our whole workup.
Yeah.
So this is the way you see it, and you've interacted with other ways of seeing it, and you've richly understood those other ways of seeing it, and they do not move you, right? They do not. They may have added something to you. Now that's part of how you see it.
Yeah. But what about
And
people in the...
Go ahead.
What about people in the second set of standards, right? The people presenting this second set of standards, they don't necessarily need to try to incorporate information in the same way. Like they don't necessarily have to participate in the same algorithm, right? Of incorporating new information. Yeah, and so they could just decide to not, to just decide what they have is stable and just
they could certainly prefer it. And let me say, let me give an easy way to prefer it. They prefer it because it's theirs stubbornly.
Right.
The question is, can they continue to prefer it once they have entered into a rich information exchange
of
the sort that we've tried to articulate?
Yeah.
Now, this is a huge, and some people would say it's not fair, right? Like, oh, I get it. In other words, all I've got to do is become like you almost, right?
Right.
And then I'll see it your way.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, no kidding. If I became like you, I'd see it your way almost by definition. And that's not right. And that overlooks a key distinction. No, you don't have to become like me. Not entirely. You don't have to become like me. You just have to know what it is to become like me. You just have to know what it is. You've got to be able to enter into it imaginatively, and I'll grant you, that's a hard task. But it doesn't mean you've got to become like me. Absolutely, it's possible to enter into, to become, get in contact with, understand the arguments, understand the kinds of people who make these arguments, know what those people are like, know what their lives are like, know what their rational thought life and the product of their thought life is like. Now that is a highly educated task for a very rich tradition. But we do this, in my defense, all the freaking time. Right? When somebody says, I just don't think that's what electrons are. Right? I just don't think that's what they are. Unless you can rehearse, unless you can step into and give the rationale for electrons being what electrons are said to be, right, in contemporary, than say in the Standard Model, unless you can repeat something on that, unless you can point to the experiments people make, unless you can point to the kind of theories that they considered when they were making those experiments, overthrew those. In other words, unless you learn some freaking physics, you're not taken seriously. Right? I get that you can definitely hold on to your account of an electron, but you're not entitled to it because you have cut yourself off from exposure to the very information that makes a physicist. Now, that seems sort of clear in physics because we think physicists know something, but this whole enterprise is to say, you bet they know something, right? They do have, there are stable claims. It seems like they've gravitated around those domains, right? Which they have isolated out and built their community around. It's just their community doesn't know how to keep the world from blowing up and thus physics from blowing up. And thus it's not a very stable community. Now, from another point of view, that might not seem fair, but talk to the National Science Foundation about whether that's a fair thing for physicists to worry about. Whether science education and the effect of science education on physics funding and physics development is part of the practice of physics. And they'd tell you, actually, it is part of the practice of physics. That's why we require, it's why it's part of the professional responsibility of physicists to do it. Now, that's a very different way of looking at physics. That's looking at physicists as a community of practitioners, not looking at physicists as people who know certain things. Grant you. And you might say that's already to have left. That's already to be, I don't know, somebody might argue. And then the question is, can they build a community around their argument, their view? And if they can, and they can attract people into that community, then on this standard, they actually are exposing people to rich information, right, about different ways of looking at the world, and more power to it. We hopefully learn something.
Yeah.
But now they've sort of entered the game. So we've smuggled in a rationality here, but it wasn't all that. What's the rationality you smuggled in? That we're processing information such as occurs to conscious agents. And it kind of looks like we all do that whether we want to or not. Right? I mean, it kind of looks like we do all the time. And it's a pretty benign smuggle. McIntyre puts it different. He doesn't put it in information processing terms, but I think he can. And I think if he did, his argument would become stronger.
Yeah. I mean, I find this, I mean, this is totally convincing to me in all domains except the domains of religion. Right. I mean, it makes sense to me in every context except that one. Like, I think that's how people operate in every context except religion. That's the only context in which I think people would push back on this account.
I agree. If what you are describing is the way people in religious life conduct their intellectual affairs, they do not submit their judgments, right, to this kind of testing.
Right.
That's right. They don't. I think that's generally correct, that they generally don't. I mean, tons of religious people don't. In fact, it's thought to be a mark of faith or something, right? It's a virtue if you don't.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And on this view of religion, on the view of religion that emerges from this account, that's a big, big mistake. Put me in Sam Harris's camp here.
Yeah.
Sam Harris is asking exactly the same questions, or take your pick. My is the philosopher Daniel Dennett. Really my favorite because maybe I align with him more. I understand him better, and I don't understand him that well. I'm not a huge fan, but I mean, I'm not a student. That's what I mean, a huge student. I'm just somebody who likes what I see insofar as I've gone.
Yeah.
And he would put it that way, and he does put it very nicely that way. And he says some things like, we could throw religion out if only we could figure out the community part of it.
Mm-hmm.
He says that. He's very clear. The problem is these darn religious people built all these hospitals and schools and stuff, right? And they seem to anchor a kind of decency toward other human beings. They seem to anchor kinds of values historically, and damn, right? We can't do without those. I don't want to. So we have to find some way. I think I'm fairly paraphrasing Dennett. We have to find some way to capture what they have, right? Without all of the, what Sam Harris would call woohoo, right? Or whatever the phrase he uses. I think that's it, right? It's just talk that doesn't really mean anything, and you can never put it to the test.
Yeah.
So personally, I think that's exactly what's wrong with our intellectual life writ large. What's wrong with our religious intellectual life? It's the same problem. How could it? If McIntyre's what I'm claiming is McIntyre's account of what we've utterly lost, which is this holistic, what I'm calling this holistic information processing algorithm, in which you process a craft, you reach for a craft of being a human being in the world, thinking about the world, acting in the world together corporately on a coherent model, the best model we come up with so far, and we enter into this kind of algorithmic information exchange and comparison, et cetera. Without that, which we used to have, says McIntyre, we are screwed, intellectually screwed. Now, not in every area, because we isolate certain classes of problems and we build a little community that operates kind of like this in that little area. And we can get a lot of progress off the ground in just that area. It turns out it's very useful to do deep dive disciplinary inquiry. That's very useful. The problem is we're about to blow ourselves up as a result.
Yeah.
And we don't know jack about the most important things. And we punt it off to philosophers and for that matter, theologians, who, if they do know jack because they're in touch with rich traditions that they probably don't even recognize as traditions. That's the sort of thing that McIntyre would say about all of that, and does say. And he's persuaded.
Yeah.
Now, this is what I meant when I said way long time ago, if we're going to build a new infrastructure, a new town, a high information flow, network of rich communities, where those communities are analogous to buildings that you plug in to the information flow infrastructure, right? And build a bunch of those. Build communities and get them to talk to one another. Welcome to town. Come build here. And then we're going to build one building. And we're going to invite people into that building imaginatively. You don't have to agree with all this. Just look at what you can build and this sort of infrastructure, right? Well, look what it's like for one of these things to grow to maturity. Let's build one to maturity, which will be necessarily outstripping what we've done so far. It'd be looking ahead, but it will also be looking back to the best of what we've done so far. We'll be building that building, and in that building, we're going to have to point to certain features if we want to get people to move in. We're going to have to point to certain features and say, you know, that thing you've got over in your life over here, call it your American citizenship, call it your belief in fundamental human rights as being an important, you know, piece of international relations. It might be your view of revelation and your view of religion. Take your pick. All of that has a home here too. We've got a better version, and you can still be an American, and you can still be a Christian, and you can still be a Muslim, maybe not in this building, but in one right next door to us, living very, very prosperously with us, right? In a different community with some real differences from us, but in rich interchange. Absolutely valuable. The only way we get forward, the only way we live as a city is when you build a building like that in that space. The only way this team gets better, the only way this league gets better, and all these teams get better, is if we got a bunch of teams that get good. That's precisely jumping back to that analogy. That's exactly what we need to do. So that we will need to build that last part. We will need to retell the Christian story. And you can see why I've identified this as something like building a new Summa. Because you have to read McIntyre's account of the Summa in order to get to Aquinas' Summa. But this is basically what Aquinas did, was write a little introduction, a little, not entirely deep dive, but a certain resolution pass, a whole system of thought and practice, which brought together and harmonized two apparently in conflicting traditions. And he brought those traditions together and learned from both of them and wrote, you could call it a third, or you could call it the fulfillment of both of the other two. And put that into place. And then it died because we couldn't build a university for it. It died because there was no space for that thing to grow. This is McIntyre's account, not exaggerated. This is exactly the story of what happened at the University of Paris in 1270, in the 1270s when Aquinas died. And what happened to his synthesis. It did not take. That's why when we build whatever this curriculum is, it's got to be built in a way that people can come to it from a lot of different perspectives today, that people can get at it everywhere, that people can figure out what to do and what to go build on account of it, and start to build this high information flow network of rich communities from wherever they are, on whatever they most currently accept. But with this little difference, right? You move into this town and the sheriff sort of requires that you be civil to one another. You are the sheriff in this town. You only move here if all of a sudden it occurs to you that what those people over there are doing is not worthless. They're not brainless idiots. They are not morons. They are not nut jobs. They're people exploring conscious reality in a very different way than you are in certain respects. and you won't be able to benefit from what it is they are doing for you until you richly understand what it is they're doing according to them. And that's a totally different attitude toward them than nut jobs. And that's why what's being resurrected in this town is civility. In this high information flow network of rich communities, it is deep civility. It's deep respect for what other people are doing. You need those people. You're going to get a decent lead. You can tell I'm excited by this. I am actually excited by this. And I'm planning to preach it.
Yeah.
Stuff is all out there, and it's never been pulled together before. And McIntyre has pulled an enormous amount together. And there are many, many people out there that are pulling enormous amounts together. I mean, look at the service that somebody like, Sam Harris is doing, or a lot of these podcasts are cutting across disciplines and looking deep with a rigorous and respectful set of standards into new areas. And this, all of a sudden, we actually have, it's not quite a new university, this intellectual dark web, just to use that language, right? Because it'll please some people to use that language. And it is kind of like that. It is an intellectual space. And it is, I suppose it's dark in the sense that there's a lot of learning that doesn't go on TV here, right? Maybe that's what's meant by dark. Or it doesn't go on at universities exactly in this way. You can't get a course in this at a university. In that sense, it's dark, but you can build one online. You can build one on Coursera, right? Called Resurrecting Civility. So there is this new environment, but we've got to turn it into something more than it is. It's close. And the amazing thing is we've got machine learning working for us to help put this together. What we've got to do is put machine learning at the service of communities, and there are people who are doing that. And we will look at those people. In fact, I'm sure we'll bring one of them on. I haven't asked him yet, but I'm sure he'll come on. And that's a brand new thing that's happening. And we need it fast. We need it fast because unless we shoot each other in the streets and shoot our internet cables, right? And all the things that's held us together through this fragile time, this age of AI and COVID, right? As AI accelerates our hostility toward one another, and COVID takes us out at the knees when we ought to be collaborating. And we could say the same thing. It could be the age of global warming too. It's just you can't put too many words in a subtitle. That's all these big crisis problems. We've got to get good at dealing with these, and we've got to get. And it seems almost hopeless that we do. But it isn't hopeless. In fact, we're exactly on the threshold of a new possibility for doing that. But we've got to put the pieces together.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I'm just going to keep preaching. Anyway, that's it for me. Last words is if you want them, or for you, or no more.
Yeah, it's super interesting and definitely convincing that it's a good way to be. But it's interesting to me. It seems like it's mostly for people who are already interested in civility and like how you deal with your reality that it seems like most people aren't interested in trying to share ideas openly with people that they don't agree with.
That's true.
How do you bring those type of people in?
That's a really good question. Yeah, well, you're putting your finger on, that question puts its finger on a distinction in rhetoric that's enormously important. There's the arguments you use for people who are really trying to understand what's going on. And then there's arguments you use for people who just to make that simple distinction, not that those are all of one kind, but you can imagine that there are people who you want to invite in, but they're not interested in coming in. Now, the master work, unparalleled masterwork of rhetoric, demonstrating the answer to your question about those people who don't want to come in, not to learn what's actually in there anyway. You've got to give them something else that they already want, and they got to come in to get that. I mean, that's the short answer to it, right? You can only motivate people on their terms, not on your terms. You can't say, look, this is wonderful, you're going to love it. And they say, that's bullshit, I don't want that.
What no, but really, if you were fully informed, you would want it, please.
Oh, okay. I believe you now, you freaking nut job. Right? Right. That doesn't work. So, in Plato's Republic, you have the masterwork of that. And I'm looking to find a slightly different way. The language they use in the Republic and the exercise in the Republic is Socrates does this with the honor-loving passions out of control brother of Plato, Glaucon, and his money-loving younger brother, Adimantus. Those are the interlocutors in this text. And Socrates is trying to make philosophers out of them. Plato gives us Socrates making philosophers, arguing with these guys, trying to bring them into, frankly, a high information flow exchange of ideas. But they are not interested in all kinds of places. They want things that are going to benefit them, that are going to profit them, that are going to lift them up, show them that they're right, make them feel superior, give them an advantage in their life moving forward as they currently see the good, which they deeply misperceive. So what does he do? The short answer is he persuades them while hiding from them the fact that they're not healthy. That's a direct quote from Socrates talking to the older brother about the younger brother, when the younger brother makes what Socrates says was a foolish adolescent's opinion about happiness, about what the good really is, that his older brother Glaucon recognizes as a foolish adolescent opinion about happiness. It's not his own. And he says, someone, I forget who, there's only three of them in the conversation. Socrates, who's a philosopher being picked out by having an excellent memory and a fine sense for what's left out. We know that from his discussion of the education of the philosophers. Socrates, in this crowd of three, says, I can't remember who it is who had that opinion about the good, as he talks to this guy after diagnosing him for hours, right? And they of course, both remember who it is. It's Adimantus. And he says to Glaucon, would you like us to persuade him while hiding from him the fact that he's not healthy? That's precisely what these two agree they're going to do with their younger brother. If Glaucon could actually look in a mirror, he'd realize that he also has a foolish adolescent opinion about happiness. Maybe it's not quite so, it's different. It's a different account of what's worth having. And in some ways, there's more to Glaucon, that seems, than there is to Adimantus. You can see that in a place or two. Maybe I'll show you sometime. But in any case, Socrates is bringing this guy along by giving him the best city. Remember what you remember about Plato's Republic, the noble lie, right? Famous, somebody just mentioned to me, John, you did the other night, right? You recognize the reference to the article about the noble lie with regard to mass that somebody made, right? The civic building, not lie. That noble lie is basically, and you remember what it's about. We're basically gonna breed kids in a pen, and the very best people are going to be the one who breed. right? And then we're going to raise kids in pens like animals. They're not going to know who their parents are, et cetera. And the ones who are going to get to breed are the biggest, the best, the good looking, the most strongest. It's going to be hard. We're going to use straws, and we're going to draw straws. It'll be a nice even deal, except we'll make sure that the really good looking guys get all the long straws. That's the noble lie. Well, that's part of it. That's in that noble lie mix. Maybe the noble lie refers more specifically to there's three kinds of human beings: the gold, the bronze, the silver, the bronze, right? Maybe that's the very piece. I forget precisely when that language is brought in, but it's brought in that whole stew, right? That whole stew, which makes that city, which makes it not even a serious piece. How can you even look at this in a serious way? It's full of deep inconsistencies. You bet it is. Socrates is dragging Glaucon across all of these things that you'll have to take into account if you want to really understand what the good is. You have to understand the good of the whole city, the good of the whole soul, but you have to know what the city and the soul are. And how do you get somebody to come in and see that if all they're doing is looking for their own political advantage in the construction of it? The answer is you give it to them. And you hope that you smuggle them, you hope that you get them drooling, which is exactly it's the emotional dynamic, the psychological dynamic of the Republic, is you get this young man, Glaucon, drooling to find out how is it possible to get a city like that one. It's got a place for war heroes. It's got a place for homosexual war heroes of his stripe who can basically do whatever they want in public and be honored for it. It's a perfect thing. Makes great sense to me, says Glaucon. How do we get that? Well, all you have to do is put up with this it's just one little suggestion, but it's a hard thing. These guys have got to become philosophers. In other words, they've got to come into the high information flow network of rich communities. There's a whole city and wealth and reputation and sex and everything you've ever wanted it's right in this building. Come right in. That's exactly how Socrates brings somebody in who's not at all interested in actually exchanging information with you, except to use you, right? For his or her own political purposes. You have to lure them in. What I'm hoping is you can confine. I'm hoping that you don't invite everybody, frankly. I mean, everyone's welcome, but they got to come in and they've got to see up front that, look, we're not going to pull the wool over your eyes. And there is a better life for you, so the claim goes, inside this space. And you'll understand your own life better and you'll get more out of it, according to you, if you come in and play. But it might not be exactly the way you want right up front. Now, that's sort of an honest rhetoric, not hiding from them the fact that they're not healthy, but neither does it lead with everything. You have to find a rhetoric for bringing people in. What are your most pressing problems? What are the things that you know, everything's going great according to you, except for this one pressing problem, right, that you can't solve. Well, maybe in here, there's a solution to that problem. Come imaginatively and take a look. That's what that rhetoric looks like. So I'll stop there. I shouldn't have taken you so long through the Republic, except I know you both read it. And it is, you got to have it. It's you know, Martin Luther King said, if you were on a desert island, this is a good time to mention this point, with the prominence of Martin Luther King's work as a gift to us right now, right? If you were on a desert island, what book would he have, right? This is it. You might wonder why, right? Because it is so rich. It's unbelievably rich. I don't know how much King grasped of the of the subtleties of argument. But I can tell you this, you don't see the subtleties of argument, and the philosophical profession as a whole has been fairly blind to those subtleties of argument, including full professors who have written important books on the subject and who know a ton, because their discipline has driven them deeply, deeply into the Greek language, into texts surrounding this text. But they don't know how to interpret those texts because they're missing what it is that MacIntyre says was actually going on back there. They're missing, they don't understand what communities were doing. And they don't understand what the leaders and the best thinkers in community were doing back then. And this is completely fascinating. And if that were true, if MacIntyre's account were true, there ought to be a reading of texts like this, that whole disquieting suggestion, that whole lost craft he thinks we've lost, that whole craft has somehow got to be of use, right, in the interpretation of texts. He thinks it is. He wrote a short history of ethics to try to scratch the surface of that, just sketch the surface, without yet having developed all of the things that he was looking for and later was able to get a better handle on. But those things were bothering him, were in the back of his mind when he wrote a short history of ethics. And he tries to do that. MacIntyre should have, he's a busy man, who am I to tell him what to do? But if he wrote a commentary on it, it's probably a big difference. So maybe we'll have to write one. I think Trinity School should write one.
I mean, we got 4 days in a week. I mean, what else are we doing besides the 3 days we're doing the podcast? I mean, you know, just Tuesday, Thursday, write our commentary.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I've read it twice. I feel like I'm ready. Yeah.
I've taught it 20 times and it's not enough. It's very, very rich. MacIntyre's taught it 40 times, which is how I know it's 20 is not enough. Or probably more than that. That's at one point that was true. All right, guys, this has been great. Thanks for getting to the bottom of this connection, just entertaining the possibility that maybe the conscious realism which is emerging, at the very least, it's a different kind of realism. It says something else is fundamental, and that's emerging in contemporary physics for a variety of reasons. And maybe it's emerging also driven by evolutionary theory. That's what Hoffman thinks is going on, right? Mm-hmm. When you look at perception, and which he's an expert in. And maybe it's driven also by the hard problem of consciousness, which seems nearly intractable. There are people who think that they're making headway. Hoffman thinks that they're not. He understands their views. Some of the ones who are making the most headway begin with consciousness. They think consciousness is fundamental too. They just don't think it's the only thing that's fundamental. So that's the integrated information theory approach, which is one of the leading candidates for what consciousness is. Any case, those folks are all getting at the same stuff. But I think there's a philosophical path. I think MacIntyre's path gets us there too. And it gets us to a view that this information processing, just call it rational engagement with ideas, the way the world actually seems to you. Count that as information, start there. And it does look like there are accounts of truth, accounts of goodness that point toward the possibility of a different fundamental reality. And maybe that is consciousness, or maybe it includes consciousness. So, cool stuff.
What are we thinking? So Wednesday, I assume we'll just talk about whatever again.
Topic. That's right. Wednesday, open topic. And let me let the two of you put your heads together on that. And it could be anything from today's news to something we've already discussed that you want to go down the rabbit hole, or something.
What are you thinking for Friday?
That's a good question. There are some next steps to take along this line. One of them, the very first one I wanted to take, was to talk about the nature of the inquiry that all of us right now, by all of us, I mean all the people we've just talked about today, certainly the three of us, but what Donald Hoffman and Sam Harris and Annika, when they're interacting with him, when they're thinking through at this level, what are contemporary physicists thinking through when they're when they find some simplifying mathematical system and they say, what the heck is that? Right? It seems to answer a lot of problems. They're kind of doing induction on new ways of thinking. It's inductive reasoning in the sense that they're looking around. And maybe I'm selling induction short, but they're looking for patterns. They're seeing it here, seeing it there, seeing it somewhere else. And they're saying, okay, maybe there's some common element here. I'm calling that inductive reasoning, but it's inductive reasoning in search of alternative wholes. And that kind of reasoning, which people do not recognize, do not engage in, but it's old, it's famous. And because it's famous because Plato made it so in the Republic. And he illustrates it in the Republic. He operates according to it in the Republic. And he talks about its rules in the Republic. So I thought we'd get at it if we had a spare half hour today. Didn't happen. Because it's easy to get lost in this space.
Yeah.
You get lost in the space. Like, what the hell are we doing? Why are we looking at all these things? Are we out of our minds? Right? What's going on we're definitely out of our league if we're not out of our minds, right? Because we're way into areas that run very, very deep. And who are we to spend time in that space and draw parts together and start to construct a whole out of these things? You couldn't do it unless you had a university of a certain sort. And it's amazing that I think we're building a university of that sort online, and podcasts are central to it because they're the one place where this kind of conversation goes on in a public and accessible way. And this is a pretty wild point. So I wanted to spend some time on that whole line of inquiry, try to see it, try to see how it works. What are the marks of success? Is there really any, staying within logical, not committing logical fallacy, right, is a mark of success in deductive argument, right? Where you start from hypotheses and you work your way down. What are the successes when you're reaching up towards some whole that you assemble out of all the first principles from all of the various lines of inquiry? That good question. And I was thinking we'd spend some time there just to orient ourselves so that as we move forward in this whole space, we have a little bit of a feel for what it is we're doing.
Cool.
Maybe we should. No, that was a short version of it. We'll do a slightly longer. All right. Guys, thanks. It's been great.
Yeah, this was good.
Okay. See you might soon.
All right. Yeah. Sounds good.